Here in the app.routing.ts file, we can see we're going through the children, and I know I said we would go down the list, but I think the next logical choice to work with is the user single component. We're going from the user list, and then we're going to click one of those users and go to user single where we can show their details. Let's uncomment that out. We'll remove that comma and add a comma here. Under user single, we'll create a new file, user-single.component.ts, and a new file, user-single.component.html. We have created it. Now we need to register it in app module. We have created and registered our new user single component. Let's take a look at app routing to make sure that everything's working well. Oh, we need to import it here. That's single, and here. Okay, all looking good there. Now the new thing that we're dealing with is a parameter variable, which is coming through the URL. We're going to do two things. One, we need to make sure that this user list component, when we click on a user, it's going to go to the user single component. And then once we're in that user single component, we're going to grab that ID and then make an API call using that ID. Let's take a look at our API. We have single user where we go API/users and then we pass in the ID here. That will give us data of the user that we just queried for. Let's go back to our app. First order of business, make sure that these are clickable so that we can go to their single pages. Over in user list component HTML, let's make sure that right now here is our ng4 user of users. And then inside of each of those we have a user card. We're going to make this user card clickable. And we'll add router link here. Notice we're using the parameter binding way because we actually need to evaluate more than just a string. We're going to pass in an array here. The first part of that array is users. Then the second part of this is the user.id. If we were just passing in /users, we can use the router link without these brackets. But since we want to evaluate and actually logically tell what's on the right side of this equal sign, we're going to use the parameter binding here. Let's go take a look. If we click that, we go to users/1. Let's go back, users/2, and users/3. So our router link works exactly like we want. One thing I'd like to do is make sure that these show like they're actual clickable links. So if we go into user list component.ts, let's add a really quick styles here. We'll say styles is, and that's a template string, so that's a backtick. Dot user card. Cursor is a pointer. Give that a try, and we have our cursor, so it looks like it's actually clickable. We'll click it, and then we'll start working in this user single component. Back in user single component, in our ng on init, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to grab the ID from the URL, and we're going to use the router for that. And then two, we're going to use the user service to get user. All right, let's start working on that. We'll import from the Angular router. We need the activated route, which is how we get what's current in the current route. Let's say private route is equal to activated route. And the way we can grab the ID is let ID equal this.route.snapshot.params, and we'll pull the ID out of that. Now we have that number. We're going to use that user service to actually get that information. Remember, we haven't fully built this out yet, but we're going to do some wishful coding and act like we already did. This.service, which we don't have yet, but we'll grab soon, .getUser, and we'll pass in the ID here, subscribe, we'll get the user back, this.user is equal to user. We also need the user here, which is a type of user. Thanks to TypeScript, we can see that our two errors are we don't have user and we don't have our service yet. Let's grab those. And we want to pass that through the constructor so we can actually use the service. Now TypeScript is going to give us an error that getUser does not need any ID. This is really great because it looks at the user service and says this doesn't match what we actually want from the user service. Let's go take a look at the user service. User.service. And getUser, we actually want to pass in an ID here, which is a number. And then what we're going to pass back as the entire function is observable. And we pass back a user inside of that. Now this is no longer valid. We're going to use this user's URL string that we have here and pass in the number right after it, just like how our API wants. We'll use a template string. So those are backticks. And we'll say this.user's URL. And that's the cool thing about using the backticks is we can actually pass in these variables right here instead of doing it this way, this.user's URL plus, and instead of doing it that way, we can do it the clean ES6 way using the template strings. And we're passing in the ID here. We're going to map res.json, and in our API, we have .data, and we handled error just like we did earlier. That should be good enough. All right, now we have no errors. Our app is working fine. Now we actually need to use that user and display it in our HTML. Let's close that out, close the module out. We have this.user is equal to user, but we need to display it in user single component HTML. We'll do div ngIf user. We'll have h2, and we'll go user.firstname, user.lastname, and we'll use their image, property binding for user.avatar, class image.rounded, -rounded. All right, we have our user single page working exactly how we want. We have users, we can click through, see that user, and see the other user. And now we have our user single page. Next up, we're going to do a little bit of work with the map operator, and then we'll move forward and do the rest of our user section.